GoForThe2.com in with the Week 13 Thanksgiving Day Weekend Edition picks. Let's jump right into it. ACC battle, Miami and Pittsburgh. You look at this ball game last year, Miami picked up a 51-28 win. They've won 3 of the last 4 over Pittsburgh by 12.6 points per game. You look at the Panthers last week on the road in Blacksburg, played very well against Virginia Tech, lost that ball game 20-14. Now come back home to face the undefeated Miami Hurricanes sitting at 10-0. Miami struggled last week, fell behind Virginia and Kurt Benkert 14-0 before their defense took over, created some turnovers, and were able to score off those turnovers en route to the 16-point victory at home. They now go on the road playing very well from a defensive perspective. Tops in FBS in terms of turnover margin, plus 16 overall, and more importantly, do have 38 total sacks as a defensive unit. Over the last 3 games, they've really stepped it up a notch, holding opposing offenses to 88.6 rushing yards per game and 14 total sacks as a defensive unit. Miami on the year has only allowed 4 rushing touchdowns. That's one of the best in the country. They now go on the road to face a methodical offense in Pittsburgh. This is a Pittsburgh offense that does have offensive line issues. They've allowed 30 total sacks as an offensive unit, and I think that's the matchup that you want to see play out Saturday in Heinz Field. I think it really favors Miami in this ballgame. When you look at Miami's offense as well, from an offensive perspective, over the last 3 games, they're running the football more consistently. They've rushed for 198.2 rushing yards per game over the last 3 games, 7 rushing touchdowns. That's taken the pressure off of Malik Rozier in terms of making plays vertically, but he's still playing very well within the system. He's completing 56% of his passes, 2,620 yards, 23 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. When you look at Pittsburgh's third down defense as well, they're giving up 41% to opposing offenses on third downs. I think that's a critical matchup Friday afternoon in Heinz Field. And their offense as a whole struggled last week against a solid Virginia Tech defense, converting only 2 of 12 on their third down conversions. I think Miami's focused. They're playing very well on the defensive side of the ball. I think they force Pittsburgh's offense into third down and long situations, force them to beat them over the top. And I don't think they can do it. I think Miami picks up a convincing road win, 47-20 over the Panthers this coming Saturday. Classic Big Ten battle. It's Wisconsin on the road against Minnesota. Wisconsin's won 13 straight over the Golden Gophers by 14.4 points per game. They picked up this victory last year in Madison, 31-17. The last win by the Golden Gophers came in November 2003 by a score of 37-34. When you look at Minnesota overall, they struggled on the road last week against Northwestern. That's a Northwestern team heading into that ballgame that had won 5 straight. They now enter Week 13 on a 6-game winning streak. They lost that matchup 39-0. They now come back home sitting at 5-6, where they played very well at 4-2 on the year. This is a Wisconsin team that dominated Michigan. They fell behind early and did win that ball game by 14 points. But this is a Wisconsin offense that has been struggling in terms of a passing perspective over the last 4 games. They were only averaging 145 passing yards per game, 5 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and more importantly, over the last couple of games, in terms of third down conversions, they're only converting 10 of 38 third downs over the last couple of games. I think that's a matchup. 10 of 28, that's right in the area of 36%. On the year, Wisconsin's averaging 50% on third down conversions. You look at the quarterback for Minnesota, Dimry Croft is a mobile quarterback. This is a one-dimensional Minnesota offense that's averaging 196 rushing yards on the ground with their running back, Rodney Smith. They're going to utilize Dimry Croft on the perimeter to put pressure on Wisconsin's defense. When you look at the strength of Minnesota's defense, it is in the secondary. They're holding opposing offenses to 175 passing yards per game. I think they stack the box and force Alex Hornibrook to beat them over the top. I think Minnesota's in this game from start to finish. P.J. Fleck understands the rivalry. He understands that his team is at 5-6. I think he pulls out all the stops to win this ballgame. I think Wisconsin wins, but I think it's a very close game. Wisconsin 30, Minnesota 27. They remain unbeaten, but Minnesota pushes Wisconsin to the limit this coming Saturday in Minnesota at home. When you look at another Big Ten battle, it's Ohio State and Michigan. Ohio State's won the last 5 over the Wolverines by 10.6 points per game. They picked up this victory last year in Columbus by a score of 30-27. It was controversy. The instant replay that should have been a 4th down stop by Michigan. Now Ohio State goes on the road. Michigan limps into this ball game, beat up on both sides of the ball, offensively and defensively. But I really feel that the defense of Michigan will keep them in this game from start to finish. You look at Ohio State entering this ball game from an offensive perspective, rushing for 253 yards on the ground, passing for 292 through the air. But this is a Michigan defense that's still rock solid in run support, holding opposing offenses to 114 rushing yards on the ground, and more importantly, 144 passing yards through the air. Over the last 4 games, Michigan is holding opposing offenses to 119.5 passing yards per game. They do have 36 total sacks as a defensive unit, and more importantly, are holding opposing offenses to 24% on 3rd down conversions. I think this is a low-scoring game. I feel Michigan picks up the victory. I think Michigan picks up a 17-13 win over Ohio State this coming weekend. I don't think it's high-scoring. I think Michigan's able to run the football, keep their defense in the ball game, play field position, much the way they did against Michigan State. I think Jim Harbaugh understands what's at stake. He hasn't beaten a big team in the Big Ten yet. He's been unsuccessful against Urban Meyer, but I think he steps up this coming weekend. I think Michigan picks up a gutty 4-point win, 17-13 over the Ohio State Buckeyes this coming Saturday. Another intriguing battle. It's Georgia Tech. When you look at this matchup overall, Georgia lost this ball game by 1 point. They did have a 12-point lead at one point in the 4th quarter, 26-14 before they allowed that game to slip. They gave up a touchdown with about a minute left, and Georgia Tech was able to prevail by a point in that ball game in Athens. They now go to Bobby Dodd. A lot at stake for Georgia. This is a Georgia offense that rebounded last week, 381 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns against a very solid Kentucky front 7 that was holding opposing offenses to 129 yards on the ground. When you look at Georgia from a defensive perspective, they're giving up 105 rushing yards per game, and more importantly, only 170 yards to 2 opposing offenses. When you look at Georgia Tech overall, the triple option, they're averaging 319 rushing yards on the ground, but in order to stop the triple option, you need big physical defensive tackles that can disrupt timing in terms of the zone blocking. That's what Georgia has. They also have the speed to run sideline to sideline against Georgia Tech. I think Georgia does have the speed on the perimeter to exploit Georgia Tech's secondary. I think this is a big day by the Bulldogs. I think they start fast, put the pressure on Georgia Tech to match them score for score. I think the Bulldogs win this ball game convincingly, 40-20 over the Yellow Jackets in Bobby Dodd. They move on to the SEC championship game to face either Alabama or Auburn, winner of the Iron Bowl this coming Saturday. Another intriguing battle is West Virginia and Oklahoma. Will Grier got hurt last week. He will not play in this ball game. Chris Chuganoff will play. He completed over 55% of his passes, 189 yards against a solid Texas defense. But you look at overall Oklahoma, they've dominated the series. They've won 5 straight over the Mountaineers by 14 points per game. They picked up this victory last year in dominating fashion, 56-28 in Morgantown. Baker Mayfield will not start this game because of what he did last week on the road in Lawrence, Kansas. A lot of bad behavior by Baker Mayfield. He won't be the captain in this ball game, but this is still a West Virginia offense that has playmakers and can exploit Oklahoma's secondary that's given up 250 passing yards to opposing offenses. When you look at the wide receiver position of West Virginia, they have playmakers like Sills, like Jennings, like White that have combined for 206 receiving receptions, 2,889 receiving yards, and 30 receiving touchdowns. I think the matchup as well is Oklahoma over the last couple of weeks only has 3 total sacks as a defensive unit. As long as Chugginoff has time to really go through his reads and progressions, he can make plays against Oklahoma's defense. I think West Virginia is able to score points. In the end, Oklahoma wins, but I think this game is a lot closer than people think. West Virginia doesn't have a lot to play for. They're 7-4 overall. They should be loose into this ball game. They've struggled with Oklahoma in recent years, but on the road, I think they have the wide receivers to make some plays and really be in this ball game from start to finish. I think it's sort of low scoring by Oklahoma standards. Oklahoma picks up a 10-point win, 31-21 over the Mountaineers this coming Saturday in Norman. Baker Mayfield doesn't start, but he does come on. He leads this team to the 10-point win over the Mountaineers, but West Virginia plays very well against Oklahoma this coming weekend. Another intriguing battle is Purdue and Indiana. Indiana's won the last 4 over the Boilermakers by 11.7 points per game. Picked up this victory last year, 26-24. You look at Indiana overall, they blew out Rutgers at home, shut them out 34-0. It was delayed for much of the half before they pulled away in the fourth quarter by another touchdown. I think they won that ball game 41-0 over Rutgers in a long delay in Bloomington. They now go on the road to face a Purdue team that stepped up and played very well in Iowa City against the Hawkeyes. They held Iowa's rushing attack to only 82 rushing yards per game over the back-to-back weeks against Iowa and Northwestern. This front sevens played very well. They held Iowa to 82 rushing yards. They held Northwestern to 94 2 weeks ago. That's a solid effort. Over the last 4 games now, you look at Purdue's front seven, holding opposing offenses to 74 rushing yards on the ground. This is a defensive unit that's +3 in turnover margin and has recorded 11 total sacks over the last 3 games. This is an Indiana team as well that's -8 in turnover margin. Both teams are sitting at 5-6. They're both equal in terms of running the football, right around 140 rushing yards per game. Both offenses are averaging 245 yards through the air, but Purdue does have the slightly better defense, only giving up 18 points per game. I think they have the better head coach in Jeff Brom. Both teams' backs against the wall. I like Purdue to win this ball game 13 points at home, 24 to actually higher, 27-13. Purdue gets a 14-point victory over Indiana. I think it's low scoring, though. I think both defenses step up. Purdue playing at home is the difference. Look for Purdue to get a 13-14-point win in West Lafayette this coming weekend. Another intriguing battle, Florida State and Florida. Florida State has won 4 straight over the Gators by 19.5 points per game. They've dominated the last 2 matchups, but this is not the same Florida State team as they enter the Swamp this coming Saturday. Both teams are 4-6. Gators do not have an opportunity to become bowl eligible, but Florida State does. They did schedule that game against UM Monroe next weekend, December 2nd. So if they win this coming weekend, they do have the opportunity to become 6-6 overall. But this is a Florida State team, when you look at it overall in terms of defense, not the same defense that we've seen in recent years. Over the last 4 games against ACC opponents, they are giving up 227.5 rushing yards per game. That's not the same defensive front seven that we've seen in recent years by Florida State. And when you look at James Blackmon, he is a freshman going on the road in his first true rivalry game against a solid secondary in Florida. Now, Florida stepped up last week. They beat a solid 7-3 UAB team. But you look at the defensive perspective by Florida entering this ball game. First of all, they're holding opposing quarterbacks to 55% completion percentage. They've forced 5 interceptions over the last 2 games. They do have 6 total sacks over the last 2 games against solid opponents in UAB and South Carolina. And more importantly, they're able to force turnovers over the last couple of weeks, whereas Florida State enters this ballgame at -8 in turnover margin. This is not the same Florida State team that we've seen in recent years. You look at Florida as a whole, they rushed for 257 yards on the ground against a solid UAB defensive front seven. I think Randy Shannon has the crew ready. They have them focused. This is their bowl game. They would love nothing more than to knock out Florida State from bowl contention. I like the home team in this matchup. I think Florida is able to run the football. I think they're able to make enough plays in the passing game, and the Gators pick up a 27-23 victory over Florida State this coming weekend. Should be a great game, but Florida does prevail and knocks out Jimbo Fisher from bowl contention. Follow the radio show every Saturday morning, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific. College Football Today, Channel 262, Dish Network, or Fantasy Sports Television and Radio Network. College football is the best. I just love talking about it. Have a happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Enjoy the games.